The afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows of Henderson Music Academy, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floor of the main hall. Students rushed about with instruments clutched to their chests, their faces a mix of excitement and nervousness. Today wasn't just any day at the prestigious school. The great Professor Anton Dvorak was visiting. "He's here," someone whispered urgently, and the hallway fell silent as the heavy oak doors swung open. Professor Dvorak stepped into the building like he owned it. Tall and lean, with silver hair swept back from a high forehead, he carried himself with the confidence of someone who had received standing ovations in concert halls across the world. His sharp eyes missed nothing as he surveyed the space, a slight frown pulling at his mouth when he spotted a crooked picture frame on the wall. Headmaster Thomas hurried forward, hand outstretched. "Professor Dvorak, what an honor to welcome you to Henderson. We've been preparing for weeks." The professor accepted the handshake with a slight nod. "I trust your students are ready. I have limited time." Of course, Headmaster Thomas said, his smile a bit too wide, a bit too eager. "We've selected our top 10 pianists for you to evaluate. All exceptional talents." Professor Dvorak made a non-committal sound in his throat. In his 40 years as a concert pianist and instructor, exceptional had become a watered-down word, meaningless in its overuse. True exceptional talent was as rare as a perfect diamond. As they walked down the corridor toward the auditorium, students pressed against the walls, watching with wide eyes. Some clutched sheet music to their chests like shields. The professor didn't acknowledge them, having long ago grown accustomed to being viewed as a walking legend rather than a man. "We've prepared the Steinway for your master class," Headmaster Thomas continued, filling the silence. "And afterwards there's a small reception where the piano has been properly tuned." Professor Dvorak interrupted. "This morning, sir, by our best technician." The professor's response suggested he'd believe it when he heard it. They entered the auditorium where about 60 students sat in neat rows, their posture straightening simultaneously as the professor walked in. On the stage sat a magnificent grand piano, its black surface gleaming under the lights. Professor Dvorak approached the instrument, running his fingers over its edge with the gentle touch one might use for a lover. He played a quick scale, listening to each note with critical precision. Seemingly satisfied, he turned and took a seat in the front row, crossing one leg over the other. "Begin," he said simply. One by one, the selected students performed their pieces. They were good, technically proficient in the way that came from years of disciplined practice. The professor watched with half-lidded eyes, occasionally jotting notes in a small leather-bound notebook. After the 5th student finished a complicated Chopin piece, Professor Dvorak closed his notebook. "Is this truly the best Henderson has to offer?" he asked, his voice carrying throughout the silent auditorium. "These students play correctly, yes. The notes are right. The tempo is acceptable. But where is the soul? Where is the fire that separates a player from a musician?" Headmaster Thomas shifted uncomfortably. "Perhaps you could offer some guidance, Professor. That's why we've invited you to elevate our program." "I cannot teach passion," the professor replied coldly. "Either it exists or it doesn't." A woman in the back of the room stood up then, her movement drawing all eyes. Ms. Chen, who taught music theory to the younger students, was normally quiet and reserved. To see her rise in apparent challenge to the great Dvorak sent a ripple of surprise through the audience. "Perhaps, Professor, you haven't heard all we have to offer," she said, her voice soft but clear. Professor Dvorak raised an eyebrow. "Oh? You have a hidden virtuoso tucked away somewhere?" His tone made it clear how unlikely he found this possibility. Ms. Chen smiled slightly. "There's a boy. He's not part of your scheduled auditions. He's younger, only 12, and new to our school, on scholarship." "And why would I be interested in hearing this child?" the professor asked, impatience evident. "Because he plays like nothing you've ever heard," she said simply. A murmur ran through the crowd. Everyone knew who she meant. The new boy who rarely spoke. The one who spent every free moment in the practice rooms, who avoided the formal recitals but whom they'd all heard playing when he thought no one was listening. "Ms. Chen," Headmaster Thomas interjected nervously, "I'm not sure this is appropriate. The boy has no formal training. He wouldn't want to. He plays by ear," Ms. Chen continued, addressing the professor directly. "He taught himself. But when you hear him, She trailed off, unable to find the words. Professor Dvorak's laugh was sharp and without humor. By ear, no training? And you think this child deserves my attention? He looked around the room, inviting everyone to share in the absurdity. I do, Ms. Chen said firmly. The professor's amusement faded into irritation. He'd encountered this type before. Well-meaning teachers who discovered a child who could play Fiorelise and believed they'd found the next Mozart. Very well, he said with dramatic resignation. Bring forth this prodigy of yours. Though I warn you, I've heard countless natural talents in my day. They play with feeling but no discipline, with heart but no skill. He stood up and gestured broadly to the assembled crowd. If this boy plays with genuine skill, I'll kneel right here. The challenge hung in the air, meant to be impossible. Professor Anton Dvorak, who had performed for queens and presidents who had never knelt for anyone in his professional life, kneeling for a child? Unthinkable. Ms. Chen didn't react to the mockery. She simply nodded and walked out of the auditorium. In her absence, uncomfortable whispers filled the room. The other instructors looked concerned, students excited by the drama unfolding. This is highly irregular, Headmaster Thomas muttered, mopping his brow with a handkerchief. Indeed, agreed the professor coldly. But it will be educational for your students to understand the difference between true talent and misguided enthusiasm. 5 minutes stretched to 10. Professor Dvorak checked his watch pointedly. Just as he was about to declare the matter closed, the side door opened. Ms. Chen entered first, her hand gently guiding a small figure. The boy who followed her kept his eyes fixed on the floor. He was slight for his age, with unruly dark hair that fell across his forehead. His school uniform looked a size too big, the sleeves nearly covering his hands. Unlike the confidence shown by the previous performers, everything about this child screamed that he wished to be anywhere else. This is Lee, Ms. Chen said quietly. Lee, this is Professor Dvorak. The boy glanced up briefly, meeting the professor's stern gaze for just a moment before looking down again. He offered a small, awkward bow. Well, young man, Professor Dvorak said, making no effort to soften his intimidating presence. I'm told you play the piano. With no training. Lee nodded almost imperceptibly. Speak up, boy, the professor commanded. Yes, sir, Lee said, his voice barely audible. I play. And what will you play for us today? Bach, Beethoven, or perhaps something more suited to beginners? The boy looked confused. I don't know their names, he admitted. I play what I hear. Someone in the audience stifled a laugh. Professor Dvorak didn't bother hiding his sigh. Very well. Go ahead. He gestured to the piano and resumed his seat, already mentally composing the diplomatic yet firm critique he would offer afterward. Ms. Chen whispered something encouraging to Lee, who nodded and slowly made his way to the piano. He sat on the bench, his feet barely reaching the pedals. For a long moment he just stared at the keys, not touching them. We're waiting, the professor said dryly. Lee placed his hands on the keys, closed his eyes, and took a deep breath. The audience leaned forward slightly, curious despite themselves, and then he began to play. The first notes were tentative, simple, a melody that seemed to ask a question. But within seconds, those simple notes blossomed into something complex and beautiful. His small hands moved across the keyboard with growing confidence, building a song that seemed both familiar and entirely new. In the audience, Professor Dvorak's expression shifted from dismissive to puzzled, then to something else entirely. He straightened in his seat, eyes fixed on the boy's hands, which now flew across the keys with astonishing speed and precision. The melody transformed again, incorporating elements of classical structure but veering into unexpected harmonies. It was as if the boy was having a conversation through the piano, expressing things that words could never capture. Throughout the auditorium, people sat transfixed. Some had closed their eyes, lost in the music. Others watched in disbelief as this small, shy boy created something magnificent before their eyes. And at the center of it all was Professor Anton Dvorak, the great maestro, his notebook forgotten on his lap, his face a portrait of someone whose world was being rearranged note by note. The boy played on, unaware of the impact he was having. Lost in his own world of sound and emotion, his music spoke of joy and sorrow, of questions and answers, of a soul far older than his 12 years. As the final notes faded into silence, No one moved. The spell remained unbroken for several heartbeats. Then Lee opened his eyes, blinking as if waking from a dream, and looked out at the audience uncertainly. It was Professor Dvorak who moved first. Without a word, without taking his eyes off the boy, he rose slowly from his seat. Professor Dvorak stood motionless, his eyes never leaving the small boy at the piano. The silence in the auditorium grew heavier with each passing second. Students exchanged glances, unsure what would happen next. The great maestro, known for his harsh critiques and impossible standards, looked as though he'd seen a ghost. Then, with deliberate slowness, Professor Dvorak walked toward the stage. His footsteps echoed in the silent hall. He climbed the 3 steps to the platform and approached Lee, who sat frozen, hands still resting on the keys. "Where did you learn to play like that?" the professor asked, his voice transformed, the mocking tone completely gone. Lee looked up at him with wide eyes. "Nowhere, sir. I just play." "Impossible," Professor Dvorak whispered, but there was no accusation in the word, only wonder. He turned to face the audience, his expression serious. "Everyone out, except the boy and Ms. Chen." Headmaster Thomas stepped forward. "Professor, I'm not sure that's out." The command brooked no argument. The students and faculty filed out reluctantly, buzzing with whispers. When the last person had gone, leaving only the professor, Ms. Chen, and Lee in the vast auditorium, Professor Dvorak returned his attention to the boy. "Play again," he said. "Something different." Lee hesitated, glancing at Ms. Chen, who nodded encouragingly. He turned back to the piano, thought for a moment, then began to play once more. This time the melody was lighter, almost playful, dancing up and down the keys like sunlight on water. But underneath ran a current of something deeper, a complexity that shouldn't have been possible for someone with no formal training. Professor Dvorak circled the piano slowly, watching Lee's hands from different angles. The boy's technique was unorthodox, even incorrect in places, yet the music that emerged was extraordinary. It wasn't just the notes themselves, but the feeling behind them, as if Lee could translate emotions directly into sound. When Lee finished, the professor spoke again, his voice quiet. "How long have you been playing?" 3 years, sir. And who taught you?" Lee shrugged slightly. "No one. There's a piano at the community center where my grandmother works. I started playing when I was 9. You've never had lessons? Never studied music theory?" "No, sir. My grandmother couldn't afford lessons. I just listened to people play and tried to copy them. Then I started making up my own songs." Professor Dvorak ran a hand through his silver hair, a gesture that made him suddenly seem more human and less like the intimidating figure of moments before. "You have a gift," he said simply, "a rare gift." He turned to Ms. Chen. "You were right to insist I hear him." Ms. Chen smiled softly. "I knew you would understand once you heard him play." The professor returned his attention to Lee. "Do you know what I promised before you played?" Lee shook his head. "I said that if you played with genuine skill, I would kneel." A faint smile crossed the professor's face. "In 40 years of teaching, I have never knelt for anyone." With that, Professor Dvorak lowered himself to one knee before the piano, before the astonished boy. "You have humbled me," he said, "and that is a gift far greater than any I could give you." Lee stared at him, clearly not understanding the significance of the moment. Ms. Chen's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "What happens now?" Lee asked quietly. Professor Dvorak rose to his feet. "Now, we have work to do." The next morning found Lee sitting nervously in a small practice room waiting for Professor Dvorak. After the events of the previous day, everything had happened quickly. The professor had spoken privately with Headmaster Thomas, then with Lee's grandmother on the phone. There had been a lot of serious faces, a lot of words Lee didn't fully understand, and finally, an announcement that Professor Dvorak would personally work with Lee for the remainder of his visit. The door opened, and the professor entered carrying a thick stack of sheet music and a leather briefcase. He placed everything on the small table in the corner and took a seat across from Lee. "Can you read music?" he asked without preamble. Lee shook his head. "As I suspected." The professor leaned forward. "Lee, what you have is extraordinary, but it's like a diamond that hasn't been cut, beautiful in its raw state, but not yet showing its true brilliance." "I don't understand," Lee admitted. "You play from here. the professor said, pointing to his heart. That cannot be taught. But there's also this, he tapped his head, the technique, the theory, the structure, that can and must be learned if you're to develop your gift properly. Lee looked at the intimidating stack of music. You want to teach me all that? I want to show you the path, the professor corrected. The journey will be yours to take. For the next hour, Professor Dvorak introduced Lee to the basics of music notation. The boy absorbed the information with surprising speed, making connections that impressed even the seasoned instructor. It was as if Lee already understood music intuitively and was simply learning a new language to describe what he already knew. You're a quick study, the professor remarked. Now let me show you something. He went to the piano and played a short, complex piece, his fingers flying over the keys with practiced precision. When he finished, he looked at Lee. Did you catch that? Lee nodded and moved to the piano. After a moment's hesitation, he replicated the piece almost perfectly. Professor Dvorak's eyebrows rose. Again, he said, playing a longer, more difficult passage. Again, Lee listened and reproduced it with only minor mistakes. Extraordinary, the professor murmured. Your ear is... I've never seen anything like it. Lee looked down, uncomfortable with the praise. My grandmother says it's weird how I can do that. Not weird, Professor Dvorak corrected firmly. Rare, special. He paused, studying the boy. Lee, do you know why music exists? Lee thought about it. To make people happy? Partly. Music exists to express what cannot be said with words, to connect souls across the barriers of language, culture, time. The professor's voice softened. When you played yesterday, you spoke directly to everyone in that room without saying a word. Do you understand how precious that is? Lee shook his head slowly. I just play what I feel. Exactly, the professor said with unexpected gentleness. And that's the part I cannot teach you, the part you already have. But I can help you refine it, give it structure, make it even more powerful. There was a knock at the door, and Ms. Chen entered with Lee's grandmother, a small woman with kind eyes and work-worn hands. She rushed to Lee and hugged him tightly. Grandmother, this is Professor Dvorak, Lee said in a different language, then switched back to English. Professor, this is my grandmother, Mrs. Wang. Mrs. Wang bowed slightly. Thank you for taking interest in my grandson, she said with a slight accent. Ms. Chen has explained what an honor this is. Professor Dvorak inclined his head respectfully. The honor is mine, Mrs. Wang. Your grandson has a remarkable talent. Mrs. Wang smiled, though her eyes held concern. We are simple people, Professor. I clean offices at night. Music lessons. She spread her hands in a gesture that conveyed the impossibility. That's what I wish to discuss, the professor said. With your permission, I would like to mentor Lee, not just during my visit here, but afterward as well, through regular video lessons and periodic in-person sessions. Lee translated this to his grandmother, whose eyes widened. The cost, she began. Professor Dvorak held up a hand. There would be no cost to you. In fact, I've spoken with Headmaster Thomas about expanding Lee's scholarship to cover additional resources he'll need. When Lee translated this, Mrs. Wang's eyes filled with tears. Why would you do this for us? She asked. The professor looked at Lee, who was watching the exchange with wide eyes. Because once or twice in a lifetime, if a teacher is fortunate, they encounter a student who has the potential to surpass them. A student who reminds them why they began teaching in the first place. He smiled slightly. Your grandson made me kneel yesterday, Mrs. Wang. In my world, that means something. Ms. Chen stepped forward. We've prepared some tea in the faculty lounge. Perhaps we could continue this discussion there. Lee, would you like to stay here and practice a bit more? Lee nodded eagerly, already turning back toward the piano. As the adults filed out, Professor Dvorak paused at the door. One more thing, Lee. He pulled a small recording device from his pocket and placed it on top of the piano. Play something original, something that tells me who you are. Then he closed the door, leaving Lee alone with the piano. For a moment, the boy sat still, fingers hovering above the keys. The events of the past 24 hours seemed unreal, like a dream he might wake from at any moment. The great Professor Dvorak kneeling before him, offering to be his teacher, saying he had a gift. Lee took a deep breath and began to play. This time he didn't think about technique or impressing anyone. He simply let his fingers tell the story of a boy who had found his voice through music. a boy who, for the first time, was beginning to believe that his dreams might be possible after all. 3 weeks had passed since Professor Dvorak's first encounter with Lee, and everything had changed. The initial 2-day masterclass had extended into a 3-week residency at Henderson Music Academy, with the professor canceling other engagements to focus on his new protege. Word had spread quickly through the musical community about the prodigy the great maestro had discovered, and the pressure was mounting. Again, Professor Dvorak said, his voice firm but not unkind. The transition between these two sections needs to be smoother. Lee nodded, his face a mask of concentration as he positioned his hands over the keys once more. The piece was Chopin, far more complex than anything he'd attempted before he met the professor. Learning to read music while simultaneously tackling classical compositions was like learning 2 foreign languages at once. But Lee was determined not to disappoint his mentor. He played the passage again, focusing on making the transition flow naturally. Though his fingers occasionally stumbled over the unfamiliar patterns, the emotion he poured into the music remained undimmed. When he finished, Professor Dvorak nodded approvingly. Better. Much better. He sat down beside Lee on the bench, something he'd started doing more frequently as the formal barriers between them had gradually dissolved. You're making remarkable progress. It's still not right, Lee said, frustration edging his voice. I can hear how it should sound in my head, but my fingers won't do it. That's normal, the professor assured him. Your musical instincts are racing ahead of your technical abilities. The gap will close with practice, he tapped the sheet music. Remember, these notes are just a map. The real journey happens here, he pointed to Lee's chest. And here, he touched his own temple. Lee sighed. Sometimes I miss just playing whatever came to me. Professor Dvorak's eyes twinkled. Who says you can't? Technical training doesn't replace creativity. It enhances it. He stood up and checked his watch. We've been at this for 2 hours. Take a break. Play something of your own. Relief washed over Lee's face. He flexed his fingers and closed his eyes, letting his mind wander. After a moment, music began to flow, a melody that spoke of both struggle and hope, of the strange new path his life had taken. The professor listened intently, his head slightly tilted. You're incorporating elements of the classical pieces we've been studying, he observed when Lee finished.
Do you hear it?
Lee nodded. I didn't do it on purpose. They're just in my head now. That's how it should be. You're building a vocabulary, a musical language that will let you express yourself more precisely. The professor gathered his notes. That's enough for today. Remember, we have visitors tomorrow. Lee's stomach tightened. Do I really have to play for them? They're coming specifically to hear you, the professor reminded him gently. The director of the National Youth Orchestra and 2 board members from the Philharmonic Foundation don't rearrange their schedules for just anyone. What if I mess up? Professor Dvorak placed a hand on Lee's shoulder. Then you'll mess up, and the world will continue spinning. His tone softened. Lee, talent like yours comes with responsibility. These people can offer opportunities that neither I nor Henderson Academy can provide. But they need to hear you play. Lee nodded reluctantly. I'll practice tonight. Not too much, the professor cautioned. Rest is as important as practice. Your grandmother will have my head if you're up all night at the piano. Again? This drew a small smile from Lee. His grandmother had quickly overcome her initial awe of the famous professor, and now treated him with a familiar respect that sometimes bordered on motherly scolding, especially regarding Lee's health and rest. As Lee gathered his music, Professor Dvorak studied him thoughtfully. You know, when I was about your age, I played for an audience for the first time. Lee looked up with interest. The professor rarely spoke about his own childhood. I was terrified, Dvorak continued, convinced I would fail spectacularly. My teacher at the time, a fearsome old man with hands like bear paws, gave me some advice I've never forgotten. What did he say? He said, Anton, the audience doesn't want you to fail. They've come to experience something beautiful. Your job is simply not to get in the way of the music. The professor smiled at the memory. Not to get in the way of the music, I've carried that with me for 50 years. Lee considered this. Did it help? Were you still scared, terrified? The professor admitted. But when I started playing, something strange happened. The fear didn't disappear, but it transformed, became energy I could use. He patted Lee's shoulder. "Get some rest. Tomorrow we'll take care of it." The following afternoon, Lee peeked through the curtains at the small but distinguished audience gathering in the Academy's recital hall. Besides Professor Dvorak and the Academy staff, there were 5 visitors, important-looking people in expensive clothes, speaking quietly among themselves. "They're just people who love music," Ms. Chen said, appearing beside him. "Just like you." Lee doubted that very much, but he appreciated her attempt to calm his nerves. He wiped his sweaty palms on his pants for the 3rd time in as many minutes. "Front row," Ms. Chen confirmed. She wouldn't miss this for anything. Headmaster Thomas appeared backstage looking more nervous than Lee felt. "Are we ready?" "They're all seated." Lee nodded, not trusting his voice. "Remember what we discussed," Professor Dvorak said, suddenly beside them. "Start with the Bach to demonstrate technique, then the Chopin for emotional range, and finish with your own composition." "What if they don't like my music?" Lee whispered. "Then they have no ears," the professor replied simply. Headmaster Thomas cleared his throat. "It's time." Lee walked onto the stage, the polished floorboards creaking slightly under his feet. The small audience fell silent. He could see his grandmother in the front row, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her face a mixture of pride and anxiety. Next to her sat Professor Dvorak, his expression calm and confident. The Steinway grand piano waited center stage, its lid raised, keys gleaming in the soft lighting. Lee sat on the bench, adjusted its height, and took a deep breath. For a moment, his mind went completely blank. The notes, the instructions, everything he'd practiced, gone. Panic rose in his chest. He looked out at the audience, at the expectant faces, and felt the weight of their expectations crushing him. His hands hovered over the keys, trembling slightly. Then his eyes met his grandmother's. She smiled, that same smile she'd given him thousands of times. The smile that had greeted him when he came home from school. The smile that had comforted him when nightmares woke him. The smile that told him no matter what happened, he was loved. Next to her, Professor Dvorak gave an almost imperceptible nod. "Don't get in the way of the music." Lee closed his eyes and began to play. The Bach prelude flowed from his fingers with a precision that surprised even him. As he played, his nervousness faded, replaced by a deep focus. The notes on the page, which had seemed like strange symbols just weeks ago, now guided his hands across the keyboard with growing confidence. He transitioned to the Chopin piece, allowing himself to lean into the emotional swells of the music. Where the Bach had been mathematical and precise, this was all heart, a storm of feeling captured in sound. Lee felt the music resonating not just in the piano but in his very bones. When he reached the final piece, his own composition, something magical happened. The boundary between Lee and the music seemed to dissolve entirely. He wasn't playing the piano. He was the music itself. The melody he'd created spoke of his journey, the community center where he'd first touched a piano, the long hours of his grandmother working to give him opportunities, the shock of Professor Dvorak kneeling before him, the struggle and joy of these past weeks of intense learning. Lee poured everything into the music, all his fears, hopes, gratitude, and determination. His small hands moved across the keys with both precision and abandon, finding notes that shouldn't have worked together, but somehow created harmony. The music built to a crescendo that filled the recital hall, then gentled into a conclusion that felt like a question mark, as if to say, "This is where I am now." But where will tomorrow lead? As the final notes faded, Lee opened his eyes. For a moment, nobody moved. The silence was complete. Then his grandmother stood up, tears streaming down her face, clapping with unrestrained joy and pride. Professor Dvorak rose beside her, his usual reserve broken as he applauded vigorously. One by one, the visitors stood, their faces showing the unmistakable impact of what they'd just witnessed. Headmaster Thomas hurried onto the stage, beaming, "Ladies and gentlemen." Lee Wangley stood and bowed awkwardly, overwhelmed by the response. As he straightened, he caught Professor Dvorak's eye. The maestro wasn't just applauding, he was smiling, a full, genuine smile that transformed his stern face in that moment. Lee understood something important. The music that had always lived inside him, the music he'd been afraid might be stifled by rules and training, hadn't diminished at all. Instead, it had grown stronger, clearer, more powerful, and somehow, in sharing it, he had touched something in each person in that room. For the first time since this journey began, Lee felt not just hope, but certainty. Whatever came next, the music would show him the way. 6 months had passed since Lee's performance for the visitors from the Philharmonic Foundation. 6 months of changes so profound that sometimes Lee felt like he was living someone else's life. The small apartment he shared with his grandmother now contained a baby grand piano, a gift from the foundation, delivered by 4 men who had struggled to maneuver it through the narrow hallways. Their living room had been rearranged entirely to accommodate it, with his grandmother insisting she didn't mind losing the space. "Music needs room to breathe," she'd said, running her hand lovingly over the polished wood. Lee practiced 4 hours every day after school. 3 days a week, he had video lessons with Professor Dvorak, who had returned to his regular teaching position at the National Conservatory, but remained deeply involved in Lee's development. Once a month, either Lee traveled to the professor for in-person instruction, or the professor came to visit him. Today was one of those in-person days, and Lee was anxious. He sat at his piano warming up with scales as he waited for the professor to arrive. His grandmother bustled around the apartment, straightening things that didn't need straightening. "You're playing too fast," she commented as she dusted a shelf for the 3rd time. "The professor always says to feel each note," Lee smiled. His grandmother had absorbed so much musical knowledge these past months that she sometimes sounded like a teacher herself. "I'm just warming up," he explained, but he slowed his pace anyway. A knock at the door made both of them jump. His grandmother hurried to answer it, smoothing her hair as she went. Professor Dvorak entered, bringing with him the aura of authority that never quite left him, even as his relationship with Lee and his grandmother had grown warmer. He carried his usual leather briefcase and an additional folder tucked under his arm. "Mrs. Wang," he greeted with a slight bow. "Lee, you're practicing already, excellent. Would you like tea, Professor?" Lee's grandmother asked. "I made your favorite." "That would be wonderful," he replied, setting down his things. "But first I have news." He looked at Lee with an expression that was difficult to read. "Important news." Lee's hand stilled on the keys. "Good news or bad news?" "That depends," the professor said, taking a seat in the armchair near the piano. "The National Youth Orchestra has offered you a position." Lee's eyes widened. The National Youth Orchestra was legendary, the training ground for many of the country's finest musicians. They rarely accepted anyone under 15, and Lee had only just turned 13. "That's wonderful," his grandmother exclaimed, clasping her hands together. "There's more," Professor Dvorak continued. "The Philharmonic Foundation wants to sponsor a special performance. You would play a short solo program as part of their annual fundraising gala. Many influential people in the music world attend this event." Lee swallowed hard. "When?" 6 weeks from now." 6 weeks? His voice cracked slightly. "But that's so soon." Professor Dvorak nodded. "It is soon. Too soon, perhaps. That's why I said whether this is good news depends on you." He leaned forward. "Lee, you're ready musically. Your progress these past months has been extraordinary. But performing at this level in that setting, it's different from anything you've done before. How many people would be there?" Lee asked quietly. "About 500. Lee felt the blood drain from his face. His largest audience so far had been 20 people at a small recital at Henderson Academy. His grandmother placed a supportive hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to decide right now, do you, Professor?" "They need an answer by the end of the week," he replied. "But no, not today." He opened his briefcase and pulled out several sheets of music. "However, if you do decide to accept, this is what you would play." Lee took the music, scanning the notes. Chopin, Debussy, and an unfamiliar name. "Who is Chen Yi?" "A brilliant contemporary composer who blends Chinese and Western musical traditions," the professor explained. "I thought it fitting given your heritage. The piece is challenging but would showcase your emotional range beautifully." Lee's grandmother peered over his shoulder at the music. Though she couldn't read the notes, she had developed an uncanny sense for when something would be difficult for her grandson. "It looks very complicated," she observed. "It is," Professor Dvorak agreed, "which is why we must begin preparation immediately, even before you decide." He gestured to the piano. "Shall we?" For the next 2 hours, they worked through the pieces, with the professor breaking down the most challenging sections, and Lee absorbing the guidance like a sponge, despite his nervousness about the potential performance. Lee found himself drawn to the music, especially the Chen Yi composition with its familiar yet innovative tonalities. When they finally took a break, Lee's grandmother insisted they eat. She had prepared a feast, dumplings, noodles, and all of the professor's favorites that she had learned over the months of his visits. As they ate, the conversation turned again to the upcoming decisions. "I think I want to do it," Lee said suddenly. Professor Dvorak paused, chopsticks halfway to his mouth. "The orchestra, the performance, or both?" "Both," Lee said with more confidence than he felt. "If you think I'm ready." "It's not about what I think," the professor replied. "It's about what you believe you can do." Lee's grandmother watched him carefully. "Lee has never backed down from a challenge," she said proudly. "Not when he taught himself to play, not when he first came to Henderson, not when you began teaching him." She turned to her grandson. "But this must be your choice, not because you feel pressure." Lee thought about it, poking at a dumpling with his chopsticks. "I'm scared," he admitted. "But," he struggled to find the words. "It's like when I first started playing." "The music was already inside me. I just had to find the courage to let it out." Professor Dvorak smiled, a rare, full smile that transformed his austere face. "That's the right reason," he said softly. After dinner, as the professor was preparing to leave, he pulled a small envelope from his folder and handed it to Lee. "One more thing. The director of the orchestra asked me to give you this." Lee opened it carefully. Inside was a handwritten note and a flash drive. "It contains recordings of the orchestra's recent performances," Professor Dvorak explained. "He thought you might like to hear the musicians you'll be joining." Lee held the flash drive like it was made of gold. "Will you tell him yes? Tell him I accept?" "I will," the professor promised. "We'll start intensive preparation tomorrow." At the door, he paused. "Lee, do you know why I've invested so much time in your training?" Lee shook his head. "Because once in a great while, a teacher encounters a student who reminds them why music matters, why it's worth dedicating one's life to this art form." His voice grew unexpectedly emotional. "You've given me that gift. Now it's time to share your gift with the world." After the professor left, Lee sat at his piano in the quiet apartment. His grandmother had gone to bed, exhausted by the excitement of the day. He plugged the flash drive into his laptop and put on headphones. The sound of the National Youth Orchestra filled his ears, 60 young musicians playing with precision and passion. He closed his eyes, imagining himself among them, adding his voice to their collective story. Then he imagined the gala, the lights, the audience, the expectation. Fear fluttered in his stomach, but underneath it was something stronger, determination. Lee opened his eyes and looked at the piano. 6 weeks wasn't much time. He needed to work harder than ever before. Quietly, mindful of his sleeping grandmother, he began to practice the Chen Yi piece, his fingers finding their way through the complex patterns with growing confidence. Outside his window, the city lights twinkled against the night sky. Somewhere out there were hundreds of people who would soon be listening to him play, people who might be moved or inspired or changed by his music, just as he had been changed by finding his voice through the piano. The thought both terrified and exhilarated him. 6 months ago, he had been a boy who played in secret, afraid to be heard. Now he was preparing to share his music with the world. Whatever happened next, whether triumph or challenge, he wouldn't face it alone. He had his grandmother's unwavering support, Professor Dvorak's guidance, and most importantly, the music itself showing him the way forward. Lee played on into the night, his heart full, his path clear at last. The grand concert hall of the Philharmonic was like nothing Lee had ever seen. Crystal chandeliers hung from high ceilings adorned with intricate gold leaf patterns. Plush red seats stretched out in a vast semicircle, now empty but soon to be filled with hundreds of people in formal attire. The stage itself seemed enormous, the magnificent concert grand piano at its center looking somehow both inviting and intimidating. "Breathe," Professor Dvorak reminded him as they stood in the wings. "Remember our rehearsal this morning. The acoustics are excellent, you don't need to force anything. Let the hall carry your sound." Lee nodded, unable to find his voice. He was dressed in his first ever tuxedo, tailored specially for tonight's performance. The collar felt tight around his neck despite the tailor's assurance that it fit perfectly. "Where's my grandmother?" he managed to ask. "Front row, center," the professor replied. Just as we arranged. The past 6 weeks had been the most intense of Lee's young life. Every day after school he had practiced until his fingers ached. Professor Dvorak had temporarily relocated to be closer, working with him daily, refining every phrase, every transition, every emotional nuance of his program. The Chen Yi piece had proven especially challenging, with its complex rhythms and blend of musical traditions, but something about it spoke to Li deeply, as if the composer had created a musical bridge between his heritage and his future. 10 minutes, a stagehand announced quietly. Professor. Dvorak placed both hands on Li's shoulders and turned the boy to face him directly. Li, listen to me. In a few minutes you will walk out there and play. You've prepared thoroughly. You know these pieces in your mind, in your hands, and in your heart. Li swallowed hard. What if I make a mistake? Then you make a mistake, the professor said simply. Music isn't about perfection. It's about truth. Play your truth and nothing else matters. He straightened Li's bow tie. Besides, I have something to tell you that might help with the nerves. What's that? A small smile crossed the professor's face. The Chen Yi piece you're playing tonight. She's in the audience. Li's eyes widened in horror. The composer is here? You're telling me this now? I'm telling you because she specifically requested to attend after hearing about you. She wants to hear her music through your hands. The professor's eyes softened. That's a gift, Li. Not a reason for fear. Before Li could respond, the hall lights dimmed slightly, the signal that the performance was about to begin. It's time, the professor said, giving Li's shoulder a final reassuring squeeze. The stagehand nodded to Li, and suddenly he was walking onto the vast stage, the polished wood floor gleaming under the lights. The audience, which had been a quiet murmur of conversation, fell silent as he appeared. The sight was overwhelming, hundreds of faces looking at him expectantly. Men in tuxedos, women in evening gowns, all here to listen to him play. Li felt a momentary surge of panic, his steps faltering slightly. Then he saw her, his grandmother in the front row, wearing the new dress they'd bought specially for this night. Next to her sat Professor Dvorak, who must have hurried through the back corridors to take his seat. And there, just a few seats away, was a woman Li recognized from photographs as Chen Yi herself. Watching him with gentle curiosity, Li reached the piano and bowed as he'd practiced, the movement feeling stiff and unnatural. The silence in the hall was absolute as he took his seat, adjusted the bench, and placed his hands in his lap for a moment to steady himself. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and remembered the community center where he'd first discovered the piano, the worn keys, the slightly out-of-tune strings, the joy of finding music within himself. He remembered Professor Dvorak kneeling in astonishment, his grandmother's constant support, the journey that had led him to this moment. When he opened his eyes again, the fear had subsided. This wasn't about impressing anyone. This was about sharing the gift that had changed his life. His hands rose to the keys and he began to play. The Chopin came first, flowing like water through his fingers. The piece he'd struggled with in those early lessons with Professor Dvorak now felt like an old friend. Li leaned into the emotional swells of the music, letting it carry him past his nerves. He moved to the Debussy, his touch growing more confident. The impressionistic waves of sound washed over the hall, drawing the audience into a world of light and shadow, of gentle movement and stillness. Li found himself smiling slightly as he played, lost in the beauty of the composition. Then came the moment for Chen Yi's piece. Li took a brief pause, gathering himself for the challenge ahead. He glanced toward the composer, who nodded almost imperceptibly. Permission, encouragement, understanding. The first notes rang out, sharp, distinctive, unlike the Western compositions that had preceded them. The piece began with a musical phrase that echoed traditional Chinese melodies, before transforming into something entirely new. Li's hands moved across the keyboard, finding the delicate balance between technical precision and emotional truth that the composition demanded. As he played, something remarkable happened. The distance between Li and the audience seemed to dissolve. He wasn't performing for them. They were experiencing the music together. He could feel their collective breath, their attention, their emotional response. It wasn't a one-way communication, but a shared journey. The piece built to its challenging climax, a section that had given Li trouble right up until the final rehearsal. His fingers found the complex patterns without conscious thought, muscle memory and musical instinct guiding him through. When he reached the gentle, questioning conclusion of the piece, the final notes hung in the air like a conversation not quite finished. There was a moment of complete silence when he finished, that magical space between the end of the music and the world's return. Lee sat motionless, hands still poised above the keys, hardly daring to breathe. Then the applause began. It started gently, almost tentatively, before swelling into something overwhelming. The audience rose to their feet in waves. First his grandmother and Professor Dvorak, then Chen-Yi herself, then sections of the hall until everyone was standing. Lee stood shakily and bowed as he'd been taught. When he straightened, he saw his grandmother wiping tears from her eyes, her face radiant with pride. Professor Dvorak was applauding with uncharacteristic abandon, his usual reserve completely gone. And Chen-Yi was smiling broadly, nodding her approval. The applause continued, showing no signs of fading. After a second bow, Lee was unsure what to do next. He hadn't prepared for this level of response. From the side of the stage, a stagehand appeared with a single perfect rose, which Lee accepted with surprise. Then another surprise. Professor Dvorak was walking onto the stage, followed by an elegant woman Lee recognized as the director of the Philharmonic Foundation. The professor shook Lee's hand formally, then broke protocol by pulling him into a brief, fierce hug. "I told you," he whispered. "Your truth." The director approached the microphone set up at the front of the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen, what a remarkable discovery we've made in young Lee Wang." She turned to smile at Lee. "I think we're all in agreement that we've witnessed the birth of an extraordinary musical career tonight." More applause thundered through the hall. The director gestured for Lee to join her at the microphone. Hesitantly, he stepped forward. "Would you like to say something?" she asked quietly. Lee looked out at the sea of faces, strangers who had been moved by his music. He spotted his grandmother again, her hands pressed together in joy, and found his courage. "Thank you," he said simply into the microphone, his voice small but clear in the large space. "Music has given me so much. I'm grateful I could share it with you." The audience applauded again. As Lee turned to leave the stage, he caught Professor Dvorak's eye. The maestro who had once mockingly promised to kneel if Lee played with skill was looking at him not as a student or a prodigy, but as a fellow artist who had found his voice. Later, at the reception, Lee stood beside his grandmother as people lined up to congratulate him. Chen-Yi had spoken with him briefly, her kind words about his interpretation of her piece leaving him speechless with gratitude. Representatives from music schools and concert venues pressed business cards into Professor Dvorak's hands. The future was opening up before him, bright with possibilities he'd never dared to imagine. "How do you feel?" his grandmother asked quietly in their native language, her hand holding his tightly. Lee considered the question. The fear was gone, so was the overwhelming sense of pressure. What remained was something simpler and more profound, the certainty that he had found his path. "I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be," he answered. And he was.